So now brave men lived in joyance, prosperous and happy, till lo, one began to do deeds of evil, a fiend of the pit. Grendel his name was, a savage spirit, great stalker of marshes, he that held the moors, the fen and the fastness, a being all hapless that haunted a while the home of strange monsters, ever since the Maker drove them into exile.
Sasquatch, the anthropology of the unknown.
This is the first time in history, to anyone's knowledge, that this type of thing has been convened on the Sasquatch Bigfoot phenomena, and I am in hopes that a cohesive effort by all concerned will come out of it, not just investigators, but the anthropologists, so on and so forth. Now, there have been a few papers presented which I felt had no bearing whatsoever on Sasquatch, Bigfoot, that type phenomena.
What papers were those?
Frankenstein, vampires, Hollywood, a la Hollywood, werewolves, little people that I would equate with leprechauns and gremlins. I really don't feel they have any place in this conference.
The Monster Legend is the second of 5 programs based on a rather unusual conference on humanoid monsters held at the University of British Columbia in 1978. It is prepared and narrated by Radio Canada International's Susan Lumsden, who attended the controversial sessions on that elusive Pacific Coast creature known as the Sasquatch, or Bigfoot.
The monster Grendel from the medieval poem Beowulf, heard at the beginning of the program, has nothing whatsoever to do with the Sasquatch, according to Rich Grumley of the California Bigfoot Organization. He and the other hunters at the conference, those who have tramped through the Pacific rainforests in search of the huge ape-like creature, had little time for such academic puffery, particularly from the artsmen, like Dr. J. Miller and others you will hear in this program. In between return visits from Beowulf's Grendel, they will trace the monster tradition in European and American literature, from the earliest jottings to the current debate on the Sasquatch. To set the stage, here is Dr. J. Miller of the University of Washington.
Monsters are a universal feature of all human cultures. They're a vital part of every culture. Monsters serve to mark boundaries, to mark potential sources of threat, of disorder, of chaos, of psychological anguish among all human societies. Monsters exist at the peripheries of the known world. They exist at crucial junctures in terms of social categories. The monsters that I've been particularly concerned with mark off the boundary of humanness for American culture. These are the humanoid monsters, like Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Dracula, and the Mummy.
Can you be more specific about Frankenstein and Dracula and the Mummy? What boundaries do they signify in the human consciousness?
For American culture, it's my assertion, they represent as a collectivity, negative aspects of what it is to be an ideal American. Each one, in turn, is a negative reflection of something that Americans hold to be important to be human. Frankenstein represents the immature and the mechanical, which a proper American should not be. Dracula represents the abuses of power, and in fact a rather untidy habit of sucking other people's blood, getting at sort of ideas of you are what you eat, food, relationships, and also the responsibilities of power. The Mummy is a bit out of the class of the others in the sense that he represents a mystical power. And then the last one is the Wolfman, who represents sort of a total submission to nature, the lack of brutish nature, the lack of sort of civilizing influence. In American and Canadian society, monsters belong to the realm of children. It's very difficult for adults to take them seriously, and that's been an experience throughout my research. People sort of look at me and sort of chuckle because I'm dealing with something that's kid stuff. It's not really all that serious, when in fact it is, and very, very serious in terms of the boundaries of American culture. Europeans, on the other hand, tend to regard monsters as part of a literate tradition where they serve as metaphors for various kinds of relationships.
If monsters ever had a heyday, it was in Europe during the Middle Ages. And according to Dr. David Jeffrey of the University of Victoria in British Columbia, they were quite widespread. He elaborates.
The monster phenomenon in the Middle Ages is a very important part of Nordic literature, especially German, Norse, Old Swedish, Old English, where long before that period, that part of the world was Christianized, there were monsters evidently in the literature. And even after the literature is Christianized, they still play a part. In fact, they even have a tendency to reshape some of the Christian ideas, notably ideas of St. Augustine, when they come into the literature. And I think that basically the interest in monsters in Germanic mythologies has to do with the interest in family purity, racial purity. That sounds strange at first, but it is true that in the northern literature, the monster is always somebody who is a threat to family order. He's an outsider. He represents an alien and an outcast. And he is not somebody who can be incorporated into the family group without doing a terrific violence to it. He damages social order, essentially. Now, in the South, monsters, for example, in Neapolitan literature or Italian literature or French literature, the orcs, the orcas, the ogres, and so on, are oftentimes quite benevolent, quite friendly. Yes, they're outside the social order and so on, but nobody's having a panic about it. That is a little bit more like St. Augustine. The Mediterranean tradition seems to be more tolerant and easygoing about it. St. Augustine actually was interested in monstrosities of all kinds because, you see, if you're a Christian theologian, and the world contains monsters as well as good things in creation, you have to account for those monsters and extravagances in some way or otherwise. It appears that God wasn't all that wise, or at least was careless. And so Augustine, in accounting for that, simply looks at all those monsters and says they're a demonstration of the diversity of God's creation, and the diversity is there to teach us what the good is like as well. And therefore we're to love the diversity and to include it and incorporate it. In other words, people who are deformed or people who are monstrous races or monstrous individuals ought not to be regarded negatively, but ought to be regarded as fully human and capable of redemption and so on, and incorporated in the human family. The northern tradition is starker, and the monsters are represented as perhaps of all the dark and inhospitable forces which stand outside the much more precariously organized human society.
Have you taken your study back even further into the Hebraic and Jewish traditions? Are there monsters, say, in the Eastern Mediterranean cultures?
It is true that the Bible, for example, produces much of the original reference to this sort of thing. For example, the passage in Baruch or in Genesis, the giants in the earth that came and involved themselves with the race of men and produced very strange and unhappy figures of the sort that do things like build the Tower of Babylon and get people into a lot of trouble. They're there. And of course, everybody remembers the story of David and Goliath, where in fact the symbolic representation of the negative force is this giant whom David must defeat, of course, if he can take on the attributes of kingship. And that kind of theme is exactly the same kind of theme that you get later on in a poem like Beowulf, an Anglo-Saxon Germanic poem, way on into the 8th and 9th century A.D.
With Grendel, alone with the monster, this giant being, I will hold parley. I have learned that the monstrous being, in his wild folly, despiseth weapon. I forgo it therefore. No sword shall I bear, nor yet broad buckler, no yellow shield to battle, but I with hand grip shall grapple, with the fiend and for dear life struggle, foe with deadly foe.
According to your theory, monsters had a very bad reputation, or they were not at all popular after the Renaissance. The Middle Ages was their heyday, perhaps until now. What happened in Renaissance thinking and culture and so on that made monsters less important in European cultures?
I think if you get an orientation to empirical thinking, then you're likely to be skeptical if you don't have actual concrete evidence. And in the Middle Ages, there were all manner of things encoded in popular belief which came from obscure travelers' reports or the mythologies and so on. And there wasn't such a sharp distinction between mythological reality and scientific reality as there grew to be in the Renaissance. So that for the Renaissance, it was important to, catch a Sasquatch, if you like, put him on the table, dissect him, and make sure that you had the real thing. And when you look at the medical histories which deal with this kind of phenomena at the time of the Renaissance, for example, Tulp's history, you see that what they're really concerned to do is to establish, are we dealing with an orangutan or a gorilla, or do we have a real human being here or not? And there is some discussion, and there's some examples of some analysis of individual cases and so on. But by and large, the question gets dropped for lack of evidence. That's really what happens in the Renaissance. It only begins to become lively again where it seems to be you get a turning away from that very strong confidence in a rational world order, which the Renaissance and the Enlightenment produced, of course, and which has been with us up until now, after all. It's only very recently that we've given up that notion, that sort of Darwinian notion of liberal intellectual progress, which gave us a confidence that we did have rational handles on things. I think it's really highly significant that we're having a Sasquatch conference just now.
Yeah. I was going to trip back a little bit to the Middle Ages, or at least the Renaissance, and say that even during Shakespeare's time, in the first Elizabethan era, if we read the works of Shakespeare and Spencer and Donne and so on, monsters in various forms were still very prevalent there. Can you elaborate on some of them?
Yes, Caliban is a good example, who, after all, comes up in Shakespeare's wonderful play, The Tempest. And there's reason to suspect that Caliban, as a monster, whose name is a kind of inversion of cannibal, is related to a long tradition of dog-like monsters, dog-like or dog-man monsters in the Middle Ages, to which the manticore is related. The dog-headed man, the Kinocephali, is an example of this. And you can see the etymological connection between canine and the other words cannibal and Grendel in the poem Beowulf, and some of the old Italian ones.
Nor was the monster minded to dally. Nay, of a sudden, he seized a warrior asleep, and without let, tore him, biting his sinews, drinking blood in streams, swallowing great bites. Soon had he ended, and eaten all up, the lifeless body, feet, hands and all. Nearer advancing, he laid grip upon the great-hearted hero where he rested, the fiend outreaching with hand towards him. Beowulf met him quickly with thoughts of malice and propped him on his arm. Forthwith he found that master of evil that he ne'er had encountered in this middle world, these regions of earth, in any other man, a mightier hand grip.
And at least until the end of the Elizabethan period, there was an interest in that sort of thing. It's also, however, in the very same period, under the very same Queen Elizabeth, that you get a very strong desire on the part of the intellectual elite, if you like, to reject this sort of thing. So that the book which codifies most of these things in its time, Boisteau's little history of wonderful secrets in nature, which he dedicated to Queen Elizabeth, she turned down flat, wouldn't accept the dedication, and the poor man died in embarrassment.
Monsters, you said, had a bad go of it in the Renaissance and in the subsequent Age of Reason. Yet, I think for most of us who are at all familiar, say, with Western English literature, monsters have survived somehow in Irish literature and to some extent Scottish literature. How do you explain this when they've sort of disappeared in other circles?
I think there are a couple of good reasons for this. One of them actually has to do with the fact, curiously enough, that Celtic literature is more diverse and more various than Nordic literature. It's less static in some ways. It incorporates all sorts of what we might call surd elements in its composition. And one of these, it seemed to me, became very clear in one of the papers yesterday, when in fact we had a discussion of the Irish wild man, who continues right to the present in the literature and so on, who actually is not so much a Sasquatch or a monster type as he is representative of savagery of a kind. That is a very much more civilized or cultural role that his monstrosity involves here.
And to introduce those more civilized Irish monsters, here is Dr. Gordon MacLennan of the University of Ottawa as he spoke to the assembled academics and hunters at the Sasquatch conference.
Well, there are some points of resemblance between the wild man of Irish Gaelic tradition and the Sasquatch. There are important ways in which they differ. One of these is that the wild man of Celtic tradition is not anonymous. The Irish knew well who their wild men were, and of course they still do. And what is more, they knew what made them go wild or turn into a monster. Also, these wild men are usually people of noble birth, which makes the stories more interesting. There are some common wild men who are not much mentioned in the literature. In Gaelic literature and folklore, the wild man is almost exclusively the victim of madness. Madness which can be brought on in several different ways. One is by the curse of a saint or a druid, or, in a less sophisticated way in folklore, by offending spirits or fairies. A second way of becoming a wild man is by having a terrifying experience, e.g., by being frightened out of your wits by the noise and slaughter of a battlefield, or having a frightening vision, or hearing a supernatural voice. And these latter are quite often heard in battlefields too. A third way is by the consumption of contaminated food or drink, and the last way is by the loss of a lover. Once he had become mad, the victim's habits and physical appearance changed in various ways. E.g., he takes to the wilderness and shuns company, but not all the time. Secondly, he also tends to take to the trees and travel along them, perching in them, living in them, and in mind-boggling ways making love in them. Physically mind-boggling. It's what you might call the Tarzan syndrome. Thirdly, he either wears rags or more often goes around naked, but alleviating his nakedness by eventually growing hair all over his body. Or he wears a garment made of feathers, or better still, he grows feathers all over his body. Fourth characteristic is that he develops tremendous speed. A fifth one is that he gets the ability to perform great leaps. In some cases, these leaps are so great that they merge into levitation, and in other cases, they become even flying. Sweeney is a 7th century character. He is identified in one version of the tale as a king of a little kingdom in northeast Ulster. Now, he goes mad in a battle. Now, Sweeney wasn't a good Christian. Ireland had barely been Christianized about a century before that. And one day, he saw St. Ronan marking out territory for a new church with a missal in one hand and a bell in the other. And he went rushing out in a fury because this was his territory, told him to cut it out, took his missal from him, turned it into a different kind of missile, and threw it into a lake. Now, St. Ronan went one better than that. He got an otter to dive in, bring up the missile, and take it back to him. But then Sweeney, to prove he was really serious, killed one of Ronan's followers, a cleric. Ronan, at this point, to show he was really serious, cursed Sweeney. And at that point, a messenger arrives to tell Sweeney that the battle is about to begin. Sweeney is a great warrior, and he rushes off to do his bit. Now, he takes a leading part in the battle, but at some point, his courage deserts him. This is where the curse takes effect. He looks up to the sky in this main version. Obviously, it means that he's seeing a vision, because this is a common theme, a terrible vision. He becomes scared by the noise and the din of battle. He experiences what lots of people must have felt in these situations, a great longing to leave the scene. And he does this with a great leap, which takes him right out of the battlefield onto a neighboring tree, which is a sacred tree and was full of other people sitting up there. Who didn't want to take part in the battle, conscientious objectors, the sick, the halt, the lame, and some common ordinary madmen. Now, a second version, I would like to quote you just a little bit from a second version which tells you exactly what Sweeney felt like. It says, Sweeney, in the middle of this battle, was filled and intoxicated with tremor, horror, panic, dismay, fickleness, unsteadiness, fear, flightiness, giddiness, terror, and imbecility. The Irish have always been loquacious. From then on, he lives in the treetops. He reckons this is the safest place to be. And he shuns people as far as possible, moving restlessly all over Ireland and even across the sea to Scotland. He grows feathers on his body and graduates from leaping to actually flying. In one of his many adventures, he escapes from a diabolical hag by a series of incredible leaps. This hag can also do these incredible leaps, but she misjudges at some point and leaps over a cliff.
And one of the things that I found really interesting was, in fact, the way in which it seemed to me that the Christian literature, the Bible particularly, continues to inform older Celtic versions of these same German tales, to transform them and keep them alive in ways which actually accord with what you might consider to be the prevalent cultural mythology of Irish and Scottish areas. So that, for example, the ancestor to the wild man in much Irish literature, it seems to me is to be found in the biblical book of Daniel, if I can find it here, in which the story is told about Nebuchadnezzar, the king, who you may remember was a very proud fellow, and he was told that if he didn't smarten up, he would turn into a beast. He'd go out and wander around for a while, and when that happened, he would take on the form of an animal and eat grass and so on. Here's what it says happened to him when it did. He was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Now, if you know anything about wild Irish men and wild Scotsmen, you notice that they all have feathers, or very many of them do, and they have long claws like bird's claws. And lo and behold, if you look at Irish sermons of the 18th century on the book of Daniel, you'll find, in fact, that there's an astonishing conflation of the story of King Nebuchadnezzar with those stories. In other words, I think there's a lively interpenetration still in Irish and Scots culture of two kinds of what we might call, in the loose sense, mythologies. The one is the ongoing use of the Christian story, the biblical story, and the other is those Gaelic elements which produce the kind of wild men that we find in Beowulf.
So one would almost think that for the artsmen at the conference, monsters are nothing new at all. They've always existed, and it's really, the scientists that are in for the surprises or have made the discoveries here.
Well, I hope the scientists will have made some discoveries. We're going to perhaps find that out. But I think, yes, for a person in the arts, what's really interesting about this conference is the way in which it really describes a tradition in the sociology of religion, the sociology of mythological foundations, and so on. The really interesting question is, why do cultures have monsters? What sort of shadow role do they represent in society? Why is it that, in fact, they have very many of the same features? They're humanoid. They seem to behave the same way. They seem to have the same kinds of symbolic roles, whether we're looking at ancient biblical literature or medieval British literature or Amerindian literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, since there are no obvious immediate connections between those peoples, it would seem to be that something in the nature of human organization itself, social and, if you might, we might say religious organization, calls forth associations here, which can be traced through. And that's what I think is really interesting. You're looking at, it seems to me, a kind of an interesting casebook in the sociology of religion when you're looking at the study of the Sasquatch.
Yet, for many people at the conference, the hunters, the Sasquatch has nothing whatsoever to do with religion, sociology, or literature. To conclude, Dr. J. Miller.
There's a general distinction here in the conference and also in the wider world between levels of reality. There are people who want reality to be three-dimensional concrete, who really want Sasquatch to exist. And then there are other people who think of reality as existing primarily in the mind rather than in physical reality. And, you know, accord Sasquatch a reality, a conceptual reality, and are concerned with the cultural ramifications of the meaning of Sasquatch as a symbol, and are neutral, if not skeptical, about the concrete three-dimensional reality of a Sasquatch. He and she exist in the consciousness of certainly the members of the conference and the wider Canadian and more limited American society. And we're concerned with what that existence has to say about humanity generally. There's another group of people who are concerned specifically with Sasquatch, not the ramifications in terms of other monsters or in terms of other humanities, but rather Sasquatch as a being with a living, breathing, concrete, footprint-leaving existence.
So what we have here, in effect, is a debate about the way we think.
Well put.
You have been listening to The Monster Legend, the second of 5 programs entitled Sasquatch, the Anthropology of the Unknown. Next, the politics of Sasquatch, the personalities and the rivalries in the search for the creature. This program was narrated and produced by Susan Lumsden with the assistance of Elizabeth Janes and Catherine Tallman. Readings from Beowulf were by John Grenfell. Technical direction was by Michel Depassier in Montreal for Radio Canada International.